Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really provocative and influential book, Murray Rothbard's What Has Government Done to Our Money? We're going to unpack its core argument, which gives a pretty radical answer to a question a lot of us have. You know that feeling, right? Why does it seem like your savings just don't go as far as they used to? Well, this book has a surprising answer. But to get there, we first have to ask an even more fundamental question. Where does money even come from in the first place? To answer that, the book asks us to rewind all the way back. Imagine a world with no money at all, a world of pure barter, where if you want something, you have to trade something you have directly for it. Now, barter sounds simple, but in reality, it's a huge headache. Let's say you make plows, but what you need today are eggs and some bread. Well, you can't just saw off a tiny piece of your plow to trade for eggs. That's the indivisibility problem. Plus, what if the egg farmer doesn't need a plow? That's what economists call the coincidence of wants problem, or really the lack of one. The book argues that people in a free market are clever, and they naturally figure out a workaround. They start trading their plow not for what they immediately need, but for something they know everybody wants, something that's easy to trade again later. According to the book, this happens totally organically. It's not a grand plan. It just sort of evolves. A few people start trading for goods that are just plain easier to sell. And pretty soon, certain goods, things that last a long time, are easy to divide, and that lots of people find useful or beautiful, start to become the go-to items for trade. This creates a powerful feedback loop. The more a thing is used for trade, the more marketable it becomes, which makes even more people use it for trade. And eventually, the market settles on one or two commodities to be the universal medium of exchange. Historically, as the book points out, these have almost always been gold and silver. And this brings us to a really critical takeaway from the book. In this view, money isn't just some abstract concept made up by the government. It's a commodity, a useful, tangible thing that the market itself chose because it solved a real problem. Its value comes from being genuinely useful, just like any other good. Okay, so if the market is perfectly capable of creating its own sound money, that leads to the book's central question. Why on earth did the government get involved? And how did it take over? The book's answer, which this quote really sums up, is pretty stark. It argues that governments get into the money business for one main reason: to get revenue without having to send you a tax bill. You see, direct taxation is unpopular. People see it and they don't like it. But if you can control the money, you can basically create it out of thin air. And this takeover is described as a slow, deliberate process. First, the state takes over the minting of coins, calling it a sovereign right. Then comes a really subtle but crucial step. It separates the money's name, like a dollar or a franc, from its physical weight in gold or silver. This gets people thinking of a dollar as its own thing, not just a certain amount of a precious metal. Once that mental link is broken, the government can start to debase the currency. Melting down the old coins, mixing in cheaper metals, and reissuing them while pocketing the difference. And to make sure nobody objects, it passes legal tender laws, forcing everyone to accept these new, weaker coins at the same face value as the old ones. The final step in this process is creating a central bank, which basically puts this whole system on steroids. So let's talk about the government's number one tool in all of this: inflation. Now, we have to be really clear about the book's definition here. Inflation is not rising prices. Rising prices are just the symptom. In this view, inflation is the act of creating more money that isn't backed by any real commodity. Think about it. This new money doesn't just magically appear in everyone's wallet at the same time. It gets injected into the economy at specific points. The first people to get it, maybe the government itself or big banks or major contractors, get to spend it while prices are still low. But as they spend it, that new money acts like a ripple in a pond, spreading out and bidding up the prices of everything it touches. By the time that money finally trickles down to people on a fixed pension or a regular salary, prices have already gone up. Their purchasing power has been quietly eroded. And this leads to the book's most explosive claim. Inflation is not a neutral process. It is, in effect, a hidden tax that creates very clear winners and losers. The winners are those closest to the money printer: the government, the financial institutions, and politically connected industries. And the losers?
Well, they're the savers, the retirees, and the everyday workers whose income always seems to be one step behind the rising cost of living.
The book then uses the entire 20th century as its main case study, arguing that it's a long story of exactly how these government interventions lead to monetary breakdown. The author breaks this history down into a few key phases. It starts with what's called the classical gold standard, which is presented as a period of relatively stable money. That all gets blown up by World War I, which leads to a period of monetary chaos. And this all sets the stage for the Great Depression, the rise of currencies backed only by government promise, what we call fiat currency, and finally, the post-war system that many of us are more familiar with, Bretton Woods. So after World War II, the world gets on this new system, Bretton Woods. You can think of it like a big pyramid. At the very bottom, you've got the actual gold sitting in U.S. vaults. In the middle layer, you have the U.S. dollar, which was crowned the world's reserve currency. And then on top, you have every other currency, pounds, francs, you name it, and they were all pegged to the dollar. The catch was, only foreign governments could trade their dollars back for gold. Regular citizens couldn't. This basically put the U.S. dollar at the very heart of the entire global financial system.
According to Rothbard, this whole setup was a ticking time bomb. The U.S. could print more dollars than it had gold to back them, effectively exporting its inflation to the rest of the world. After already devaluing the dollar against gold back in the 30s, the pressure just kept building. But the early 1970s, other countries started getting nervous and began asking for their gold back. So, in 1971, the U.S. government closed the gold window, which is a fancy way of saying it refused to pay up. And just like that, the final, flimsy link between the dollar and gold was cut, and the whole world entered the age of pure government fiat money that we live in today.
So, after this whole historical takedown, you're probably wondering, what's the alternative? What does the book argue a good system would even look like? The answer it provides is return to something called sound money. And the core idea is actually pretty simple. Money should come from the market, not from the government. It should be a real, useful commodity whose supply is limited by the actual cost of production, like you have to actually mine more gold, not by a political decision to turn on the printing presses. The ultimate goal from this perspective is to shield private property from that hidden tax of inflation by building a wall between money and the state. And that brings us to a final thought for today. Rothbard's entire analysis was built on the history of physical things like gold and silver. But his work, written all those years ago, leaves us with a really compelling and maybe now more relevant than ever question for our digital age. In a world of crypto and instant global transactions, what would a commodity chosen by the market even look like? And that is a fascinating question to think about.